thought process here is an extension of last week. It talked about Barnabas. The lesson was titled Barnabas. But the reality is that the lesson was really about Mark and Barnabas' influence over Mark. And the same thing is going to be true here with regard to this particular lesson. That we're going to talk about Jesus, but we're going to talk about his influence in the lives of people that he believed in. Of course, we noted that Barnabas believed in Mark, and even though Mark had shown signs of weakness, of frailty, and yet Barnabas's faith in Mark was unwavering, and because of that, Mark went on to even to be accepted and desired by the Apostle Paul, who refused to take him on the second trip, and of course we know ultimately the work in penning the gospel that bears his name, and so we find that the faith of Barnabas in Mark led to great things. Now we're going to look at three things in this particular lesson. Where Jesus exhibited faith and the courage, the courage to believe in individuals that in the long run manifest themselves in ways that were not only blessings to those individuals, but blessings even to us, all through the ages, all the way down to us today. And the first is on page 134. Is in the matter of Simon, whom we commonly refer to as Peter, and again his name is Simon. His moniker, or the name that Jesus called him, was Peter, meaning a rock. In John 1, it says, "You shall be called Cephas," which is the Aramaic word for rock or stone, and so. The name Peter is a name that was given to him, given to Simon by the Lord, and then a name that carried on all the way through. And Paul used the term Cephas in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Some say, "I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas." In other places. Again, generally he is referred to as Peter, which is the Greek form of which means a stone or a rock. And so we find on page 134 with regard to Simon that his introduction to the Lord was because of his brother Andrew, and of course we know that Andrew. If we know anything about Andrew, we know this, that just about every time we read about him specifically, he's always bringing somebody to Jesus. When the multitudes needed to be fed, Andrew brought the boy to Jesus. When the Gentiles wanted to see Jesus, Andrew was the one that I believe was in John chapter 12 was told, we desire to see Jesus. In other words, Andrew seemed to be a guy that could get things done in bringing people to Jesus. And he's a great Bible character, certainly worthy of our study and emulation. But he brought his brother Peter in John 1 and verse 41. And by the way, he's called Simon Peter there in John 1 before he's ever given his name. In other words, you have to recall, John's not writing this as an ongoing narrative. He's writing it well after the fact, and he refers to Andrew as Simon Peter's brother. Well, he wasn't Peter at that time, but John writes of him in those words, and he says, he found his own brother Simon, and he said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated the Christ, and he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated a stone. And so here is the first mention of Peter, or of Cephas, or Simon, receiving this name from the Lord. Now, it's interesting that Jesus would used this name to describe Peter, given the state that we know Peter was generally in, which was not a state of stability. Now, when you think of a stone, in this case, you think of like a foundation stone. Not just like a rock that you can pick up and throw, but rather a stone or something that you would, which might be, the cornerstone as we might refer to. And so, knowing what we know about Peter, a stone would not be the word that I guess his fellows would have used. Although Brother Johnson, in writing this, he said unless they were talking about Peter being hard-headed, his head might have been like a stone, but certainly his disposition was not like a stone, because Peter again was prone to just speak without thinking. Sometimes it worked out good, sometimes it worked out not so good. But even before Jesus had ever had any interaction with Peter, he refers to him as a stone. Now, again, it's not what Peter was at the time, but Jesus saw in Peter what he could be and what he eventually would become. And so you say, well, how does Jesus do this? Now, how does he know? Well, in John chapter 2, and beginning in verse 23, the Bible says that there were many that believed in Jesus, seeing the wonders and signs that he did. It says, but Jesus did not commit himself to any man, and says, because he knew all men, and had no need that anybody should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. In other words, Jesus knew Peter better than Peter did, even from before the moment that he saw him. And so Jesus had the ability to know what Peter could be and what he would be, even though Peter himself was not there, and didn't know this about himself. It's like what's the old song? I'm just an old lump of coal, but I'm going to be a diamond someday. That's what Peter was when the Lord made him. He was a lump of coal. But Jesus saw the ability, saw the prospect in Peter for him to be more than a lump of coal, but to be a diamond. And so we see this from the very outset of his dealings with Peter. Now, over on page 135, we think about some things that lend themselves to Jesus' statement that Peter was a person who could be a rock. One being that when Jesus was walking on the water in the midst of the storm, who was it that had the faith to say, Lord, if that's you, tell me to walk out there too. Who had the faith to do that? Well, it was Peter. Many times we condemn Peter because he took his eyes off of Jesus and he saw the wind and the waves and the boisterous nature of the storm, and we think negatively of Peter because of that incident, and yet we forget the fact he's the one that got out of the boat and walked on the water. He's the one that inquired of the Lord. He's the one that had enough faith to get out of that boat and walk on the water. And so we don't want to overlook the greatness of Peter just because he faltered at that particular point in time. Then we go even a little further into the ministry of Christ, into Matthew 16. And of course, Jesus asked, they're in the coast of, they're at Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus asked his apostles, who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? Well, some say you're Jeremiah, or John the Baptist, or one of the prophets. He says, but who do you say? Who do you say that I am? Now, no. One thing I've mentioned in time past, I haven't mentioned in a long time, but it's always helpful because it's going to come up a little bit later on in this discussion, is that our modern translations do not make a distinction between singular and plural pronouns. All right? Whereas the King James Version makes distinctions between singular and plural pronouns. You can be you, or it can be you, right? Whereas, thee can only be one person. Thou is only one person. So, when you're doing your study, I used King James Version all my life until about 2008. Then I switched to the New King James. But I always have the King James Version handy in my study when I needed to figure out, when I want to figure out exactly who's being talked to here. And so, the King James makes those distinctions. When you see thee, thou, and thy, that's always singular, always. When you see, you, ye, yours, your, always plural, always plural. So when Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" He's asking all of them, okay? Because we don't know who responded. Some said that you're Jeremiah or John the Baptist or one of the prophets. We don't know who said that. Maybe it was just a summary of what one of them said. Well, some of them say you're Jeremiah, and somebody said, well, some of them say you're John the Baptist, and some of them say you're one of the prophets. Could have been several of them speaking at once. So when he says, "But who do you say that I am?" he's talking to all of them. And then who was it? Who was it that spoke up? When the question was posed to the 12, one of them in particular spoke up, and who was it? It was Peter. He says, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Of course, then Jesus said, "Blessed art thou, Simon," King James, "Bar Jonah." We just read in John 1. He said, "You are Simon, the son of Jonah." That's what Bar Jonah means. Bar means son, Jonah. Simon Bar Jonah. He says, "For flesh and blood has not revealed this unto thee, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say unto thee that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." And so you see that Jesus is speaking specifically to Peter in this particular instance, because it was Peter, again, who had the gravitas, so to speak, to stand up and say exactly what he believed. Now, that's Matthew 16:13 to 18. Then you go like 3 verses down, and it says, "And from that time Jesus began to tell them how all the things that were going to happen to him, how he was going to be delivered into the hands of wicked men and abused and killed and raised the third day." And who was it that said, "This ain't going to happen"? The same guy he just praised, earlier, and he said, "Get thee behind me, Satan." So he said, "Get thee behind me," talking to Peter. The same "Blessed art thou, Simon" is the same "Get thee behind me, Satan." So again, there shows the instability of Peter. In other words, he made a great statement. He made a great statement in verse 16, but he turned right around and made a really bad one in about verse 22. And so there's the instability there. All right, moving forward into the life of Peter. Who was it? Who was it that said that he would follow Jesus to prison and into death? Well, it was Peter. Peter. Now, did he live up to that?
No, he did not.
No, he didn't. He didn't make it, did he? Didn't he make it one day, did he? All right. On the other hand, in this same incident, Jesus says to him, he says, "Simon." Now, what else? Just open your Bible to Luke. Open your Bibles to Luke chapter 22 and verse 31. Here's where the singular and plural pronoun becomes very important. All right? Because when you don't, in other words, when you use "you" for singular and "you" also for plural, you don't know who's being spoken to. Now, in this same scenario, when Peter's making all these bold claims, he says, "Simon," this is verse 31, Luke 22:31. "Simon, Simon, indeed Satan has asked for you." Now, Walter, you told him King James, I know, right?
Yeah.
And it says you, right?
Satan has desired to have you.
Satan has desired to have you. So, and what did we say about you? As it's used in the King James. Always plural. So, who's Jesus talking about when he says Satan has desired you? Everybody. Everybody, plural. That he might sift, what? You as wheat. Plural. Next verse. But I have prayed for thee. Verse 32. I have prayed for thee, what? That thy faith should fail not, and when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. See, 4 singular pronouns in verse 32. So, Jesus says to Peter, Satan's desired everybody. All of you. But Peter, I have prayed for you. And when you are converted. So you see how the distinction, there's a huge distinction there that Jesus is not just praying. Now look, we know Jesus was praying for all of his disciples, John 17. But in this particular case, he's praying expressly for Peter. And by the way, Peter would know the language that they're speaking, and he would understand he's talking about me.
New King James made a pretty big mistake because it uses the word our in verse 32, or at least in mine it was. I think it's New King James.
Where's that?
Verse 32 is that, but I have prayed to you that our faith.
Now see, I've been telling y'all for years to put them electronic Bibles away and tote one made out of trees.
It looks just like our.
Yeah. You need a Bible made out of cows and trees. Cows on the outside and trees on the inside. Yeah, but it's New King James. And that's why I was saying that the New King James doesn't make that distinction. And by the way, none of the modern translations do. I'm not throwing off on them because obviously I use the New King James.
Obviously you bought it.
Yeah, that's right. And I bought that one for you. Well, I didn't pay for it. You did, but I went and got it. But I'm not throwing off on them. I'm just saying that that's one of the things that you won't see if you're not using another translation along, to help you alongside of it. But again, what does that mean to Peter that Jesus said, I am praying for you specifically, Peter, you, Peter. That had to be a great encouragement to Peter, right? In one sense, he's like, Peter, you're unconverted. You're unconverted. But I'm praying for you. And when you're converted, strengthen your brethren. Now who's he talking about there? He's talking about, I think he's talking about the other apostles that were there. Now, let's move forward. By the way, we're not going to get to the other 2 characters. I'm certain of that tonight. But as we carry on through Jesus' relationship with Peter, after Peter made that bold claim, I'll go with you to prison and even into death. And, if I have to die, I'll never deny you, he says. Jesus said, all of you will be offended because of me this night. And Peter said, though all these be offended, I'll never be offended. If I have to die for you, that's the extent to which I'm willing to go. And then what was Jesus' response to him? Before the cock crows, you'll do what? You'll deny me 3 times. Before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. Peter denied that was going to happen. Who was right? Yeah, Jesus is always right. He's always right. So, now you roll into the end of Luke, chapter 22, verse 61. After the third denial, what does the text say in verse 61?
The Lord turned and looked upon Peter.
That's all I need right there. The Lord turned and looked at Peter. Now, Peter had just denied Jesus for the 3rd time. less than a handful of hours after he said he'd die for him. He denied that he even knew him 3 times. And apparently, Jesus was at least within earshot. Now imagine what it must have been like to deny the Lord for the 3rd time, and then all of a sudden you look up and you make eye contact with him. I mean, can you imagine that? Just in my mind, I'm thinking, what a sickening feeling. Yeah, I'm not just talking about feeling bad. I'm talking about getting that feeling down in the bottom of your gut. You've done something, really, really bad. The very thing you said you'd never do, you just did it. The Lord turned and looked at Peter, and then what, Sean?
Peter remembered.
That's all right there. And Peter remembered. Less than 6 hours or 10 hours into this whole thing, Peter's already forgotten what the Lord said he would do. But when he looked at the Lord, he remembered. He remembered. You ever have that happen to you? Not maybe in a bad way, but sometimes this happens to me all the time. I'm bad forgetful. And I'll be thinking about, I'm supposed to do something for somebody at some time, and I can't for the life of me remember what I'm supposed to do. And then and I can't even think of who I'm supposed to do it for. And then the minute that I see them, the minute that it hits you, it's like, oh! Well, imagine that to the nth degree with Peter looking at the Lord. Now, let's take this another step further. Peter went out and wept bitterly. Wept bitterly. Now, this would have been the last time that Peter would have seen Jesus before his crucifixion. The next time, in essence, the next time Peter sees the Lord, he's hanging on a cross. We don't have any indication. In fact, we have every indication that there was not any exchange between the Lord and Peter at the cross. There was an exchange between the Lord and his mother. There was an exchange between the Lord and John the Apostle. There was an exchange between the Lord and the women as he was walking to his crucifixion and bearing his cross. There was an exchange between the Lord and a thief, but no exchange between the Lord and Peter. So now Jesus is dead. And the last thing Peter has to remember is what?
Denied him.
I denied him just like he said I would. And now he's what?
Dead.
He's dead. Now he's dead. How many people after folks are gone regret not taking advantage of opportunities? As bad as it was, Peter could have tried to make it right. Right?
He thought it was the end of it.
Yeah.
He still thought like a Jew.
Yeah.
He thought that it was going to be a Messiah.
Yeah. And now it's all over. But think about this. The last thing I ever did to the Lord was deny him, and he knows it, and now he's dead, and I can't make it right. He's dead, and I can't make it right. So now let's roll on over to Mark 16. Mark 16. What's going on in Mark 16? Well, what's going on in the last chapter of Matthew and Mark and Luke?
Probably where Peter's preaching first got.
No. What's going on in the last? What's going on? Resurrection. The resurrection's going. Last chapter of Matthew, last chapter of Mark, last chapter of Luke. Jesus is risen from the dead. Now look at Mark chapter 16 and verse number 7. The word is being sent to the disciples, the apostles. But go tell his disciples what?
And
and Peter. And Peter. In other words, a special mention of one name. Now, all of those men forsook him and fled from the garden. That's what it says. They all forsook him and fled. The only one that we know that he talked to, have any indication he talked to, was John, and that was in order for John to take care of his mother. Nothing else going on. But there's one of those other 10 guys. There's one of those other 10 guys who's got to be hurting worse than the other 9. And it's got to be Peter. It's got to be Peter. And so, in order to let Peter know that he still believed in him, the Lord mentioned him by name. Go tell the disciples and Peter. You ever think, have you ever been somewhere and somebody gives a shout out and they mention you by name? That's pretty cool. That's a pretty cool feeling, isn't it? Like somebody said, I want to shout out to all my Burleson peeps, and especially Kyle Donaldson. All right. So, but I throw Kyle a special throw out, a special shout out. In other words, especially you. Something like that's happened to all of us at some point in time. Or maybe at work, your boss or something has commended everybody kind of in general, and then maybe said something special in particular, and so in particular did this. That's a great feeling, right? It encourages you. Well, Peter needed that kind of encouragement. I mean, there's no telling how, what his mental state surely had to be. And so because the Lord had enough faith in Peter to know, again, what he could become. I mean, here we are. We're 3.5 years into this at this point. From John 1, where we started tonight, to Mark 16 is about 3.5 years. And apparently, Peter's not a whole lot closer to being a diamond then than he was in John chapter 1. Now, I think probably that's not an accurate description, but I'm just saying from the outside it appears as Peter's still floundering. He's still floundering. And then beyond that, who preached the first gospel sermon? Peter did. Who preached the first sermon to the Gentiles? Peter did. Who wrote 2 epistles in the New Testament, which, by the way, were by their very design written to Christians in order to help them endure persecution for their faith? Peter. Now, the Hebrews writer makes some mention of this, like in Hebrews chapter 12, Hebrews 11 and Hebrews 12 mentions a few things. And Paul writes to others who have already suffered. Peter writes to people who are about to suffer some unspeakable persecution. Unspeakable persecution. And he writes a letter to help them endure. In other words, what? Be steadfast. Be like a rock in your faith. By the way, when you read 2 Peter, you read that Peter says, "For I am about to put off this tabernacle, even as the Lord has showed me." Hearkening back to John 21, when Jesus told Peter, "You're going to be crucified for your faith too." And I don't mean the word crucified in the general sense of that we would use it. He told him expressly, "You are going to be hung on a cross on my behalf." And in spite of being told that, Peter from that point never wavered. Never wavered. And from that perspective, he wrote to Christians to endure, knowing that he's going to befall the same death that his Lord did. And yet from that perspective, he writes a letter of encouragement. He writes a letter of steadfastness. He writes a letter that admonishes brethren to holiness. 1 Peter 1, 15 and 16. 1 Peter 4, verses 1 to 5. I mean, over and over again, Peter encourages the brethren to be holy and to be faithful. And so, all of it ultimately made possible because Jesus had faith in him. Because Jesus had faith in him. So because Jesus was always mindful of Peter and the potential that he had, Jesus didn't lose his faith in Peter. And because of that, kind of like when Barnabas didn't lose his faith in Mark, and we see what Mark managed to do, because Jesus had his faith in Peter, we see what Peter was able to accomplish. And so now not next week, but the week following, we'll go to, we'll look at Matthew, the character Matthew, from page 136, and also the adulterous woman of John 8, beginning verse 1 and 2. And so we'll look at those two characters and probably a few others that would be related to those particular accounts. I think Zacchaeus makes a good study in the faith and Jesus being a faithful encourager. But that's where we'll pick up, Lord willing, in 2 weeks.
Let me ask you something. Didn't all the apostles die violent death but one?
Except for John, but only according to secular history. James we know was killed by the sword in Acts 12, and Peter obviously was crucified. Yeah. Those are the only two that we know about for certain. And then of course we know that John lived an old age in exile. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna write Zacchaeus' name down so I don't forget.
I read that something talking about that.